thank you, Professor Doctor, for asking me to speak here. A very good afternoon to all of you, and a big thank you to the UGC HRDC, North Bengal University, and the Department of Women's Studies for allowing me to take part in this refresher course. It has been a very enriching experience, and thank you for giving me this opportunity. What I would like to talk about today is a very recent phenomenon. After Professor Devguru's brilliant presentation on 19th century phenomenon, there will be a shift in my presentation in both ways. First, I'll move away from 19th century to this very time, and secondly, I'll talk about primarily a media which is also a very contemporary in nature. I'll talk primarily about social media representation of a very controversial phenomenon which is very current as well. Let me just share my presentation with you. Is it visible?
Yeah. Now it's visible.
Okay, thank you. So the title of my presentation is Academic Predation and Gendered Media Mediation, a case of a postgraduate dissertation as represented in social media. By the way, I'm Subrata. I have been a student of literature and I believe I still am. So as you can probably imagine, this is the thing I'm talking about. The controversy began because this dissertation, a postgraduate dissertation, Rural Chop Industry and its impact on family well-being, a study on Gajol 1, Gajol 2 and Korkoj Gram Panchayats of Malpur. So again. So this actually called a lot of attention because of the couple of lines printed on top of the dissertation. Mukhyamantri Mamata Bandyopadhyay Chopshilpo Dharanay Anupranito Hoye Gobeshanay Chopshilo. Later it was explained that it is imprinted on a personal copy, not on the copy that was submitted. And I must say I have not been privy to this dissertation at all, so I'll not talk about this dissertation apart from a couple of things which becomes very apparent from this phenomenon, from the title page itself. The first is, the area of research, in my opinion, is extremely important. An attempt at chronicling the quotidian of the marginal is a daunting task as well. And unfortunately, most of the media attention regarding this focused only on the extraordinary note on the top of the image shared, and the primary form of reception was combined with ridicule, instead of actually trying to engage with the very important, very crucial area that it tries to deal with. However, there are a couple of catches as well that needs to be remembered. Inscribing a personal copy with an elegy to the Chief Minister betrays a notion of premeditated outcome. I have not been a privy to this dissertation, so I cannot say. I'm talking only on the basis of the cover page. It certainly displays an unusual amount of pro-incumbent idolatry. And third, it also evokes an eerie sense of a diligent compliance with the government. This phrase is quoted from somewhere else, which I will come back to a little later. So after that, this came into social media, and the supervisor of the researcher got into the scenario. He delved into the social media and tried sharing this. Please note certain things. He kept hashtagging the Chief Minister and other ministers to his posts. And he made it very clear that it is actually what is supposed, that this research is dedicated towards validating a point raised by the Chief Minister. To quote, our research has proved the validity and reliability of the statement of the Honorable CM of West Bengal, and so on and so forth. Then it indulges into a very open intra-party factionalism with a very feudal overtone. Please note, he has shared these 3 copies of dissertation, and this is a video which not only contains this note, but it also contains this, Banglar Juboraj Abhishek. This is the feudal overtone, this is the factional overtone that he very openly, very brazenly delves into. And, which is most important, this post and many subsequent posts don't mention the researcher at all, apart from a few rare exceptions, one of which I'll share. Then it goes on, the supervisor now boasts, joto badha debe toto bodo research hobe, joto ninda korbi toto bodo hobo. Then it hashtags Mamata Banerjee and Firhad, apparently Firhad Hakim, Janab Firhad Hakim. Again, it does not mention the researcher, the post does not mention the researcher. Then the supervisor goes into a defensive mode. He tries to validate his position again without attributing in his entire post the researcher once. Then from defensive mode too, he goes to find support for himself. He keeps quoting, he keeps sharing sometimes Facebook messages, sometimes WhatsApp messages in various forms. He finds support for himself, again for himself, not for the researcher. And then he goes into a very offensive mode. Those you can read. And please note the very patriarchal, familial and institutional line of undertones that is taken in this offensive. এক রিপোর্টার তার মেয়েকে ভূগোল বিভাগে জোর করে চাকরি করানোর চেষ্টা করেও ফেল হল. He takes as any attempt at a critic in a very negative light. Again, he doesn't mention the researcher in this post. So from there, then he shares his plan for the future. What I'm saying is the researcher gradually vanishes, diminishes into the whole scheme the supervisor puts in. Ebar asche, and now it is what we thought of is now proved. The researcher now becomes merely a tool, a vessel to carry forward the supervisor's own extra academic agenda. The researcher becomes expendable and exchangeable. Once the Chopshilo is done, the theme will change. এবার আসছে গবেষণায় স্বাস্থ্যসাথী, অবশ্যই মুখ্যমন্ত্রীর অনুপ্রেরণায়. Please note the indomitable urge to be in diligent compliance with the government. I take this phrase from a work by Isaac Kandel. In 1935, he was writing a book called The Making of the Nazis. So what is this? In 1933, a declaration required all members of the civil service to present a written statement of their loyalty to the Reich. Primary and secondary school teachers, university instructors who were not members of the civil service composed 22% of the estimated 7 lakh civil servants, and their records were reviewed to weed out any undesirables. By January 1934, the Ministry of Education was satisfied that its work had prompted, then quote, diligent compliance with the government. This is the basic undertone of being too much of pro-incumbency. Please note, here it is not a diligent compliance under duress. Here the diligent compliance is suo motu, right? Where the academia is taking the role of validating the incumbent power. It is willingly behaving as a subsidiary of the government. The supervisor takes this dissertation to further his own agenda without bothering to even mention the researcher often. He does so in a very opportune moment. Please note, the researcher has submitted her dissertation. The results are not out yet. So we don't really know what the researcher thinks of the situation, that her research is being used in this manner. Please note. Okay, we'll get into that later. Let us look at it, how the supervisor thinks of mentioning it. Please Please note this is the only page on methodology that we have. Please note it begins with a misattribution.
আমাদের এক ছাত্রী কণা সরকার, যদিও তাকে অনেক মানুষ কানা সরকার বলছে, যারা নিজেরা কানা তারা ওই একজন শিক্ষার্থী, নিষ্পাপ শিক্ষার্থীকে কানা সরকার বলে। ওর নাম হচ্ছে কণা সরকার। সর্বপ্রথম আগে দর্শকদের উদ্দেশ্যে ক্লিয়ারিফাই করে দিলাম। তো কণা সরকার বলে একটি মেয়ে, আমাদের স্টুডেন্ট, সে মাস্টার ডিগ্রি তার শেষ হতে চলছে, এক্সাম সব কমপ্লিট। সে একটা গবেষণাপত্র জমা করেছে, টপিকটা আমি দিয়েছি চপের ওপরে, রুরাল চপ ইন্ডাস্ট্রি, সেটার উপরে টপিক আমি দিয়েছি এবং সে গবেষণা করেছে আমার তত্ত্বাবধানে রায়গঞ্জ বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়ের ভূগোল ডিপার্টমেন্ট।
So he keeps mentioning that he has given the topic. So this is the problem. His social media behavior may be argued as driven by two sets of binaries and inherent foregrounding. Older male versus younger female, a hierarchy where the former prevails, in this case with an aggressive social media propaganda. Second, idea, research idea versus actual material labor, where the former, the idea, is unequivocally prioritized. The supervisor considers it his right to exploit the dissertation because he gave the topic to the student. Please note the researcher is still singularly responsible for the research from the interviews conducted to the conclusions reached at. Thus, the aggressive, mostly non-attributing, predatory social media propaganda. Why predatory? I'll get into this now. This is not a sexual predation in academia. This is academic predation in itself. Propaganda renders the researcher voiceless, stripped of any agency, privacy, or dignity of academic labor, and to a greater extent, even an independent identity. To borrow a paradigm from Lucy Rigare, the researcher here is neutered. What is neutered? The masculine, the feminine, and the neuter, the three genders, the three genres. Irigare talks about, she writes, our social organizations and the discourse that stems from them are therefore regulated by a neuter governed by the masculine genre. A place of respite from wars and polemics between men, this neuter does not resolve the problem of the hierarchy of masculine and feminine genres, of its injustices, and of the pathogenic neutralization of languages and values that ensues. She further writes, the most forgotten symbol in the universe and in our cultures is the sexual symbol, the living symbol. In their failure to recognize this living symbol, men alone exchange women, children, products of labor, tokens, money, often stuck in the image of the feminine. They exchange something instead of exchanging. They exchange something instead of exchanging love, gods, art, thought, language. This is what is happening here. I have given the topic. Now I will reap it in social media, reap the fruits in social media. As explained, the phenomenon of socially mediated representation and usage of an academic situation, a dissertation in this case, is gendered. Even when the phenomenon is not overtly sexual, it is systematically sexuated. The phenomenon bears open an absolutely hegemonic and structurally patriarchal nature of both academia as well as social media. As if two institutions are mutually furthering one another's agenda. The researcher who engages with the quotidian of the marginal, how is her own quotidian experience within the academia shaped? This is a question I think very important to raise. The scenario also exemplifies how an unaccountable manipulation of both academic and social media spheres, combined with a brazen megalomania, grossly defies any ethical and moral responsibility of care. The elemental question of an ethics of care is the question of life itself, which is not limited to mere survival. This life is also examined, to refer to Plato. An unexamined life is not worth living. But in care ethics, as Carol Gilligan and others have pointed out, but not in isolation. This life is not in isolation, rather in an interpersonal speciality of belonging and holding one another to a bond of camaraderie. That is all care ethics is asking for. And I believe in an academic space, before one is leaping into the larger world of larger competitive world, it is the role of an academic institution to shelter, to nurture, rather than using the student in a very predatory fashion. Can there even be any residual iota of care when one half of that interpersonal is neutered? I could talk a lot about something, not a lot, a little bit about care ethics, but I'll not go there. Or rather, I'd like to conclude with a poem by Shankha Ghosh, who is not only an eminent poet, but who has also been a legendary teacher. I'd like to quote a few lines from his poem just to express my views of what I mean by this idea of care, which must be embedded into an academic scenario. It is from Miler Jonno Byektigoto in Baborer Prarthana, published in 1976. ওই হাতে হাত মুক্তি পেলে জেগে ওঠেন ব্যক্তিগত, তখন আমি সবার মুখের উৎস দেখি তোমার মতো। শিরায় শিরায় মহিরুহ ছড়িয়ে দেয় আপন বুহ, প্রগল্ভতার উজ্জ্বলতা তখনই হয় লজ্জানত। আনন্দে চোখ কাঁপতে থাকে, বুকের নিচে পূর্ণ ক্ষত। থ্যাংক ইউ।